A gift from St. Nicholas. Klaus Schlachtischlinger was a wealthy cobbler living on New Street in New Amsterdam. He was a contented bachelor who could afford mind you, pairs of breeches, and he had a little side business selling geese. He cut quite a figure in New Amsterdam society and was happy being single until he met the fair Anitji. She was as pretty as a picture, and Klaus fell head over heels for her. He was not her only suitor, by any means. The local burgomaster was also courting the fair Anitji. But the burgomaster was a stingy, hard man, and in the end, Anitji gave her heart and hand to Klaus. At first, Klaus and Anitji were very happy and prosperous, raising geese and children. But the burgomaster was a vengeful sort of fellow who began a series of improvements to the local neighborhood, charging highly for each one until all their money was gone. The arrival of a blacksmith who repaired shoes with hobnails so that the shoes lasted a year or more left Klaus, Anitji, and their 6 children as poor as church mice. Christmas Eve found the Schlachtischlinger family down to their last, cold meal of bread and cheese. Klaus was wondering what he had left to sell in order to feed his family. Then he remembered a fine pipe that he had found in one of his stockings on a long ago Christmas morning in Holland. It was a fine pipe, too good for a mere cobbler. Klaus knew even then that such a gift could only be from St. Nicholas himself. Klaus leapt up and went to dig through an old chest until he found the pipe. As he unearthed it from under a pile of clothes, a draft of cold air came from the open front door. Klaus scolded his children for playing with the door and went to close it, but found the doorway filled by the merry, round figure of a stranger. Thank you, I will come out of the cold," said the man, stomping in the door and taking a seat by the poor excuse for a fire that blazed in the hearth. The family gathered around the white-bearded old fellow as he tried to warm himself. He scolded them roundly for not keeping the fire hot, and when Klaus admitted that they had nothing left to burn, the old man broke his fine rosewood cane in two and threw it on the fire. The cane blazed up merrily, heating the whole room and singeing the hair of the cat, which leapt away with a yell of indignation, making everyone laugh. It was hard to be sober around this merry old man who made sly jokes, told riddles, and sang songs. After sitting for half an hour with the family, the old man began rubbing his stomach and gazing wistfully at the cupboard. "Might there be a bite to eat for an old man on this Christmas Eve?" he asked Anitji. She blushed in shame and admitted there was nothing left in their cupboard. "Nothing," said he. "Then what about that fine goose right there?" Anitji gasped, for suddenly the smell of a tenderly roasted goose filled the room. She ran to the cupboard, and there was a huge goose on a platter. She also found pies and cakes and bread and many other good things to eat and drink. The little boys and girls shouted in delight, and the whole family feasted merrily, with the little white-bearded old man seated at the head of the table. As they ate, Klaus showed the old man the pipe he meant to sell. "Why, that pipe is a lucky pipe," said the old man, examining it closely. "Smoked by John Calvin himself, if I am not mistaken. You should keep this pipe all your days and hand it down to your children." Finally, the church bells tolled midnight, and the little old man cried, "Midnight! I must be off." Klaus and Anitji begged him to stay and spend Christmas with them, but he just smiled merrily at them and strode over to the chimney. "A Merry Christmas to you all, and a Happy New Year," he cried. And then he disappeared. Ever afterwards, Anitji and her daughters claimed they saw him go straight up the chimney, while Klaus and the boys thought he kicked up the ashes and disappeared out the door. The next morning, when Anitji was sweeping the fireplace, she found a huge bag full of silver bearing the words "A gift from St. Nicholas." Outside the house, there arose a clamor of voices. When Klaus and Anitji went to investigate, they discovered their wooden house was now made of brick. At first, the townsfolk thought they were in league with a wizard, but when Klaus told them the story and showed them the new possessions and riches left to them by the old man, they made him the town alderman. The transformed Dutch house remained a landmark for many years following the death of Klaus and Anitji, until the British tore it down to make way for improvements in the neighborhood. Eavesdropper. There is an old tale which claims that at midnight on Christmas Eve, the cattle will kneel in the barn and speak with one another. Once an old Maryland man decided to test the tale by hiding in the barn at midnight to listen. So he climbed a rope to the window in the hayloft. He lay down on the rough gray boards, covered himself with hay, and waited. Around midnight, he saw all the cows in the barn kneel. At first he could not make out any words, but then he heard the cow underneath his hiding place say to its neighbor, "I am afraid our poor old master will not live out the year." "Oh dear," exclaimed her neighbor. "What a pity." The old man was so frightened by the cow's words that he hurried over to the window, wanting to get away from the barn as fast as he could. But his sweating fingers slipped on the rope and he fell to the ground, broke his neck, and died. Since then, the people in Maryland have never eavesdropped on the cattle at midnight on Christmas Eve. Der Belsnickel. My sisters and my baby brother danced about the house, whispering to each other excitedly about the coming of Der Belsnickel on that snowy December 5th evening, the day before the feast of St. Nicholas. According to the stories, the good St. Nicholas chains up the devil on the eve of his birthday, December 6th, and makes him visit all of the children in the village to see if they have been behaving themselves and deserve the attention of Kirschkindl. Those who are good will receive gifts, but those who are naughty, well, those children who do not know their prayers or their school recitations, or who have been troublesome at home, might find themselves whipped with Der Belsnickel's switch or tied up with his chains, and they will receive coal in their stockings instead of presents. Of course, I did not participate in the excited whispering or silly romping of the youngsters. I was above such foolishness, having turned 12 on my last birthday. Instead, I peeled potatoes in the kitchen to help me meter with dinner. I heard several pairs of feet stampeding up the stairs and shaking the floorboards over my head, and sighed a little at all the dramatics. Just then, someone tugged on my skirt, and I looked down at Hans, my 3-year-old brother. "Gretel, will Der Belsnickel come tonight?" he asked me, his huge blue eyes wide with anxiety. I scooped him up into my arms and gave him a reassuring hug. "Yes, Hans, he will come tonight," I told him. And he would too. I had seen Uncle Oscar stashing a dark costume consisting of raggedy fur-trimmed black clothes, a headband with goat horns glued to the top, a long whippy switch, and a thick, rattling chain in the empty stall in the barn about an hour before sunset. Right after dinner, Uncle Oscar would duck out to see to the horses, and a few moments later, Der Belsnickel would make his visit to see if we children had been good enough to receive the attentions of St. Nicholas tomorrow. Will he have a switch and chains? Will he tie us up? Hans asked. Der Belsnickel only ties up naughty little boys and girls. But you have been good, so you do not need to worry, I said. I put him down and he scampered off upstairs to talk to Inga and my other sisters while I finished the potatoes. There were 14 of us at dinner that night: Mutter, Fada, my 4 sisters and 3 brothers, Uncle Oscar, Aunt Helga, their 2 children, and me. As the oldest child, I watched over the others and made sure that the babies got fed. Then Uncle Oscar slipped out to feed the horses, and the grown-ups exchanged happy grins over the little children's heads. The first sign that Der Belsnickel was approaching was a loud, rude banging on the front windows. Hans and Inga screamed when a soot-covered face with long black whiskers was pressed against the glass. Then the front door burst open and Der Belsnickel rumbled into the parlor, rattling his chains. The children cowered and whimpered and screamed, half in fear and half in delight at the raggedy creature with his goat's horns and bag full of something. Was it candy or coal? The answer depended on what happened next. Der Belsnickel made all of us, even me, line up in a row in our parlor. Starting with me, we began to answer whatever questions he asked us. He rattled his switch at me and made me quote the scripture passage from last Sunday's church service. Martin, the next oldest, recited a poem he had memorized for school. And on down the line. Every time we got an answer right, Der Belsnickel would stomp about in rage because he hadn't tricked us, and the little ones would squeal. I was distracted from Uncle Oscar's antics by a strange flickering in the lantern light. Something was wrong with Uncle Oscar's shadow. I began watching his shadow as he made Ludwig recite next. When Uncle Oscar lunged one way, the shadow went the opposite way. As I watched, it lifted the chains over its head. The shadow's hands seemed impossibly long, and the fingers looked more like claws. I shivered, chills running over my skin. The horns on the shadow's head were very sharp, and the legs impossibly long. Then the shadow broke away from Uncle Oscar completely, just as Ludwig finished his recitation. While the grown-ups and children all cheered for Ludwig's success, the shadow slid over the wall like oil and coiled up near the ceiling. Then it opened glowing yellow eyes and looked straight at me. I gasped, my heart pounding in my throat, and I could feel my legs shaking. My terror was masked by the happy shrieks of the youngest children, who were watching Uncle Oscar the pretend Belsnickel stomping up and down the hallway, rattling his chains and howling in anger. I faced the opposite direction, toward the corner of the room, watching the real Belsnickel slide down the wall, his shadowy form slowly solidifying into a short, twisted figure dressed in coal black fur with a broken nose and glowing yellow eyes. No one else noticed him as he slithered like a snake past my parents and Aunt Helga and began stalking the hallway at Uncle Oscar's heels. My stomach was twisted into a knot. I wanted to run away and be sick, but I couldn't tear my eyes off the evil figure that stopped before my cousins and watched as they spelled several difficult words at Uncle Oscar's request. Johanna stumbled a bit, and her Belsnickel gave an audible chuckle and seemed to grow larger within the shadow of my Uncle Oscar. When Johanna recovered herself enough to finish spelling her words successfully, Der Belsnickel shrunk in size and frowned. Occasionally, the creature would dart a look at me and give me a twisted grin. Little Hans was the last one in line, and he was terrified. He stared up at large Uncle Oscar and couldn't breath a word. "Have you been a good boy?" Uncle Oscar asked, taking pity on the small figure. Hans nodded fervently, and Uncle Oscar patted his head and handed him a boiled sweet. Behind him, Der Belsnickel stomped in rage and then dematerialized, becoming a thick black oozing mass that gradually sank back into Uncle Oscar's shadow and was gone. I staggered a little, as if a weight had been released from me, and stared suspiciously at the shadow, wondering if the creature was really gone for good. My siblings and cousins were mobbing Uncle Oscar, demanding sweets from Der Belsnickel since they had all done so well with their recitations. As he handed out the treats, I heard a knock at the window. I looked out into a pair of glowing yellow eyes and a twisted face. "I will see you again next year, Gretel," Der Belsnickel hissed through the glass. "Try not to be too good." I screamed then and fainted, toppling to the floor before my father could catch me. They told me later that all was confusion in the parlor for several minutes, during which time Uncle Oscar slipped away. I awoke to the stinging sensation of smelling salts and clung to my muter and cried as if I were no older than Hans. My siblings and cousins laughed at me, their own fear forgotten, but my muter hushed then, realizing that my terror had nothing to do with Uncle Oscar. She sent them away to the kitchen to eat their sweets. When they were gone, I told Mutter and Fada and Aunt Helga what I had seen and heard. Fada nodded his head several times as I spoke, and then said, "Mean kind, I once saw the real Der Belsnickel too when I was about your age." I will tell you now what my Fada told me then. Der Belsnickel is bound by the goodness of Saint Nicholas. If you are a good child, if you do your best and try to be kind and say your prayers, no harm will come to you. I shuddered, remembering the look on Der Belsnickel's face when he called my name. "I will, Fada. I will, I promise fervently." I have heard that people who see Der Belsnickel also have the good fortune to see Saint Nicholas, Aunt Helga added unexpectedly. My muter told me that she saw them both at the feast the year she turned 12. Watch carefully tomorrow, Gretel, and you may also see the blessed saint. The grown-ups hustled me to bed after that, and Mutter tucked me up tight. I was quickly joined by my sisters, who drifted off immediately, but I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the leering face of Derbelznickel before me and hearing him call my name. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed the hours away as the house grew quiet and the adults went to bed. As time ticked its way toward midnight, a moonbeam shone through the window, shining across the room and dazzling my eyes. Beautiful it was, and comforting. I slipped out of bed and went to look out at that moon that was turning our room into a shadowy and mysterious place. It was as bright as noon outside, and the trees and bushes cast serene shadows over the snowy landscape. Then I saw, riding up to the road on a dashing white horse, was a bearded man dressed in red with white fur lining his hood. It was St. Nicholas. Running before him and muttering darkly was Derbelznickel. The grim little figure seemed more comic than scary now, bound by his rattling chains and forced to dance to the whim of the good saint behind him. For a moment, the saint paused in front of my house and looked up at my window. He raised a solemn hand to me, and I smiled and waved back. Then he spurred his horse away down the road, Derbelznickel scampering ahead of him like a little black dog, and they disappeared into the dazzling snowscape under the light of the full moon. With a soft sigh, I returned to the comfort of my bed, sensing that this was the last time I would see either Derbelznickel or St. Nicholas. And I knew something else too. I knew that I had nothing to fear from the grim little creature, not now, not ever. I fell asleep with a smile on my face and woke the next morning to the joyful shouts of my siblings on St. Nicholas Day. I'm all right. We knew right from the start that Johnny was going to be a soldier. Even as a child, all his concentration was on the military. So we weren't surprised when he joined the Marines right out of high school. Johnny excelled in his chosen career. He was so happy to be serving his country. I could see it in his face every time he came home on leave. He was itching to get into some real action, something that, as a mother, frightened me. He was my only son, and I didn't want to lose him. But he was also a grown man with a wife and a baby on the way. I was very proud of the way he was living his life. Then came the terrible day in September when everything in our world changed. I knew as soon as I saw events unfolding on the television that Johnny was going to get the action he craved. And I started praying, please God, keep him safe. Johnny went to the Middle East and I started sending weekly care packages and checking my email several times a day. The tone of his communications was always cheerful, if a little strained. He was in danger many times, but somehow he always made it through unscathed, although he lost a few friends along the way. This deepened him, and I saw a new maturity in my son that made an already proud mother even prouder. My relief was intense when Johnny came home. I ran to him and almost knocked him over in my excitement when he stepped out of the car. He hugged me tightly and then reached into the back seat to remove his little daughter from her car seat and show her off to us. I tried to conceal my fear when he told us a few months later that he would be going back to the Middle East. But Johnny knew me pretty well. On his last leave before deployment, he took my hand, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "I love you, Mom. We'll be together again real soon." I held back the tears until he was gone. Then I wept like a child. Johnny's emails on this trip were sporadic and his tone was grim. Things were tough over there, although he did not say much about it. He just spoke of little things like the rapid growth of his beautiful girl and the many activities of the wonderful woman who was her mother and his wife. After he'd been gone nearly a year, Johnny started making plans for his return home. He thought he might make it home in time to celebrate Hanukkah with the family, and I clung to that hope with all my strength. My husband and I always made a big fuss over Hanukkah ever since Johnny was a little boy. The 8-day Festival of Lights commemorates the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem after its desecration by the forces of Antiochus IV and celebrates the miracle of the container of oil. According to the Talmud, at the rededication following the victory of the Maccabees over the Seleucid Empire, there was only enough consecrated olive oil to fuel the eternal flame in the temple for one day. Miraculously, the oil burned for 8 days, which was exactly the length of time it took to press, prepare, and consecrate fresh olive oil. Since that time, the Jewish people have celebrated both victory and miracle each year by kindling the lights of a special candelabrum, the menorah or Hanukkah, one light on each night of the holiday, progressing to 8 on the final night. We read the sacred story, pray special prayers, eat lax and fruit-filled donuts, play games with our children, give gifts. It is a time of great joy for our family. When Johnny emailed us the news that it looked like his tour would be extended, I was upset. I had my heart set on us being together for Hanukkah this year, and the news hit me hard. But I kept on smiling, proud of my soldier boy, and only cried once when no one was around. We had my daughter-in-law and granddaughter over on the first night of Hanukkah and showered them both with food and gifts. If, perhaps, we acted a little too happy, a little too cheerful, well, who could blame us? We were all keenly aware of the beloved one who was missing from the occasion. Late that night, I awoke from a deep sleep, certain that I had heard Johnny's voice. "Mom," Johnny said again. I turned over and blinked in the dim light coming from the street lamp outside our window. Johnny was standing beside the bed, gazing down on me tenderly. I sat up immediately, my heart beating faster in excitement. Johnny was back. He had come home for Hanukkah after all. They must have decided against the tour extension. "Johnny," I gasped. He smiled and sat down beside me, as he had often done when he was little. He took my hand and said, "I want you to know how much I appreciate you and Dad. It couldn't have been easy, raising a headstrong boy like me, but you did a wonderful job." Johnny's words filled me with a great joy and a terrible fear. The military had sent him home, hadn't they? Hadn't they? Something in his beloved face told me that this was not an ordinary visit, that he hadn't come home the normal way. My heart thundered in my chest and I began to tremble, dread making my limbs feel heavy. Tears sprang to my eyes, and Johnny gently wiped one away with his finger. "I came to tell you that I am all right," he said quietly. "Take care of my girls for me." "We will," I managed to say, realizing at last what this visit meant. "I love you, Mom. We'll be together again real soon," Johnny said. He leaned forward, kissed me on the cheek, and then he was gone. I fell back against the pillows, too stunned even to weep. My husband, who was a heavy sleeper, woke when he felt the bed jerk. He rolled over and mumbled, "Are you all right?" "Something has happened to Johnny," I said, too grief-stricken to be tactful. "I think he's dead." My husband jerked awake. "What?" he exclaimed fearfully. I started sobbing then and told him about Johnny's visit. We held each other close for the rest of that long night, waiting for dawn and the news which would surely come with it. The days following the official notification of Johnny's death killed in action in the Middle East were mind-numbing. I clung to the words my boy had spoken to me in the moments right after he died. Johnny had said he was all right, and I believed him. My son's body was gone, but his essence, his soul, everything that made him my Johnny was safe and well. And we would be together again real soon.